today we'll continue from where we left in the last class, right? So we'll do a quick recap of what we have done and then move forward from here, right? So let me give you an overview of what we'll cover in today's class. Today, first of all, we will talk about multiplier effect and discuss its significance. We'll look at the formula. How do we calculate the multiplier effect? Then similarly, we'll talk about another important, calculation that is known as accelerator coefficient. So we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll move on and talk about national income statistics. So what are national income statistics? When we come to that part, I'll tell you, but can you hear me clearly? Okay, now we were in the last class, you would remember we were talking about multiplier effect, right? Now, what is multiplier effect? This is related to what we were doing, which is Keynesian growth, right? So Keynesian growth is basically a graph that predicts the GDP of an economy of a country, right? Now, linked to that is this calculation known as multiplier effect, right? But before we calculate what multiplier effect is, it's important to kind of do a quick recap of what this Keynesian growth is, right? So it's a graph, it's a model, it's a graph that predicts the GDP of a country. On the y-axis, you have AE. What is AE? AE is aggregate expenditure, right? So what is aggregate expenditure? That shows the total spending or the total demand in an economy based on the country's GDP. So based on the country's GDP or income levels, what will be the total demand for all goods and services in the economy? That is known as aggregate expenditure. So that is on the y-axis. Right, I will, don't worry, right? Except for the graphs, I'll write everything over there, right? And on the x-axis of this graph, you have GDP, which is also known as, which we denote as Y. So in economics, you will always see that GDP is denoted with Y. Okay, so aggregate expenditure on the y-axis, GDP on the x-axis. Now, what's the shape of aggregate expenditure, right? So aggregate expenditure is an upward sloping graph. Aggregate expenditure is an upward sloping graph like this, and it has a y-intercept. Now, what is this y-intercept made up of? You would remember from our previous class that this y-intercept is made up of all the naught components. So it is equals to C naught, I naught, G naught plus X naught minus M naught. Now, these naught components are basically the components which do not depend on income, right? So we did talk about that. In fact, let me also open my notes. I'll show you the definition of autonomous, right? So autonomous consumption is any consumption component that doesn't depend on the income level. So that is regardless of how much income or the GDP a country has, right? So just a second. So we have class notes, right? Okay. Now that being said, similarly, the autonomous investment mean that this investment doesn't depend on GDP, right? So that's regardless of how much is the country's GDP, right? So autonomous consumption is the component of consumption that doesn't depend on income, GDP level, and instead it depends on factors like expectations about the future, trends, income tax, etc. On the other hand, induced consumption is the component that depends on income on the GDP level of an individual or of a country and so on, right? Okay, now moving forward, so we did discuss that this is your aggregate expenditure. So this upward sloping line is your aggregate expenditure, right? And what is aggregate expenditure? That is the total demand for all goods and services in an economy based on the GDP level, right? So difference between aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure. Aggregate demand is the total spending in an economy based on different price levels. So aggregate demand looks at the demand based on different price levels in an economy, whereas aggregate expenditure is the total spending in an economy based on different levels of GDP. And that's why you can see that we have GDP on the x-axis, right? So it will be upward sloping line with a y-intercept. Now you need to draw another line. You would remember there's another x is equals to y line that we draw on this graph, and that is known as x is equals to y line. I did tell you the significance of this x is equals to y line. It basically shows that on this line, this pink line, which is x is equals to y line, the y and the x variable values are same. The y and the x variable values are the same. So whatever is the value of the GDP, same would be the value of aggregate expenditure and so on, right? Does this make sense? Okay, just give me a second. Okay, so this x is equals to y line shows us a combination of, it shows combination of values for aggregate expenditure, combination of values of x and y variable, which are same, right? So whatever is the value of aggregate expenditure, same will be the value of GDP. Okay, then I did tell you that for an economy to be in equilibrium, for an economy to be in equilibrium, the total demand or the aggregate demand, as we can say, the aggregate demand of a country, which is basically estimated through aggregate expenditure, should be the same as the aggregate supply. So whatever is being demanded should equal to whatever is being produced, because otherwise if there is a difference, we know equilibrium will not be reached. So for an economy to be in equilibrium, the total spending, the total demand for goods and services in an economy should be equal to the total production, total output that is being produced. And in this case, the GDP can be GDP can be fairly used to estimate the total production that is being produced in the country, and aggregate expenditure can be fairly used to estimate the total demand for goods and services in an economy. And that's why I've said it's aggregate demand, or you can think of it as aggregate demand. Now, wherever the x is equals to y line intersects with the aggregate expenditure, that will be your equilibrium level of GDP. That will be your equilibrium level of GDP. So I bring this dotted line down and I label it as Y1. So this is your equilibrium level of GDP. Wherever x is equals to y line intersects with the aggregate expenditure line, that is the equilibrium GDP level. Okay. Now this graph shows that at this point in time, this country will have this much GDP, equilibrium level of GDP, right? So this graph shows that this country will have this much of GDP, right? This could be any number. This could be $5 billion or $10 billion or $1 trillion or whatever, right? And so on. Okay. Now, then we talked about a couple of different things. I'll just give you a quick recap because we've already talked about it. So if any of these components, right, if you know any of these components change, which we call injections. Now think about this. So when there is an injection in the economy, right? So when investment increase or government spending increase or exports increase, these are the three injections: investment, government spending, and exports, right? Now, what is an injection? We did talk about this. Injection is additional income that comes into the system, right? Injection is additional amount of money, or that comes into the system in the form of investment, government spending, and exports, right? On the other hand, there are some withdrawals from the system, right? Circular flow of income. So you would remember the graph that we made. Circular flow of income is a graph that shows how money circulates in an economy, right, between different sectors. Now, withdrawals, on the other hand, are opposite of injections, and those include savings. So when I save some money and put it away, and I'm not using it, obviously those will be leakages from the system, right? So you also call withdrawals as leakages. So that would include savings, imports, right? So if any person in your country is spending money on foreign goods, that's known as imports. And similarly, the money that government takes away from its citizens, that is known as taxation. So these are the three leakages: savings, imports, and taxation. And the three injections in an economy are investment, government spending, and exports, right? Does it make sense? Investment, government spending, and exports. Okay, now this being said, we'll move on and talk about that. How is this related to the circular flow of, how is this related to the Keynesian cross graph that we have made over here? I'll just make another graph, right, so that I can better show you the multiplier effect on the graph, right? Okay, just a second, right? Okay, now on this graph of Keynesian cross that you can see in front of you, right? So this is Keynesian cross. Let's write this on top so that we remember. So this Keynesian cross graph is showing us the equilibrium level of GDP in a country, right? That we just saw, right? So I'm just making it again, but have a look at this, right? So let's say this is your aggregate expenditure, right? And this is your x is equals to, and this is your x is equals to y line. This is your x is equals to y line. Okay. Now this was this, X is equals to Y line that shows all combination of X and Y variable values which are equal to each other. And this other graph which has a y-intercept, this purple line is known as aggregate expenditure. Okay, now wherever the two curves were intersecting, that was your equilibrium level of GDP. So that showed how much is the current level of GDP in the country, right? This being said, just give me a second. Okay, now this being said, what happens when there is more injection? What happens when there's an injection in the economy, right? Now you have to listen to this carefully. Now this was your y-intercept, which is made up of, which we just saw, consumption, investment, government spending, plus exports minus imports. Now, if any of these components increase, have a look at this. If investment increase, government spending increase, or exports increase, what happens? The entire aggregate expenditure graph will shift upwards in a parallel way, right? The entire aggregate expenditure graph will shift upwards and it will move from AE to AE1, right? Let's say AE1. Now you have to listen to this carefully, right? Breathe. Now, where's the new equilibrium? Where's the new equilibrium level of GDP? New GDP level or new equilibrium level of GDP is where the X is equals to Y line is now intersecting with aggregate expenditure. So you bring this dotted line down, and then you connect it to the y-axis, and that would be your new level of GDP. So this Y2 is your new level of GDP. Now, what is this showing us? This shows that for this much increase in injection, there has been this much increase in the GDP of the country. For this much increase in injection, right? Let's say, your investment increase and that increase from I naught to this higher level of investment, right? So then for this much change in injection or this much increase in injection, the increase in country's GDP was equal to this much. So this is your change in GDP. Is it making sense? Okay. And this is what the multiplier effect is. Now let's go back and let's quickly write down the definition if we haven't yet, right? That what is multiplier effect and why is obviously that important for us to calculate, right? So think about this. Multiplier effect says that a certain increase in injection will result in more than proportionate change in GDP. Now, what is more than proportionate? More than proportionate means that if investment is increasing by, let's say, 5 million, then your GDP would increase by something more than $5 million, right? Are you getting? Does it make sense, right? So, for instance, if investment or exports increase by $5 million, there will be more than $5 million increase overall increase G. Does it make sense? Okay. Now moving towards the formula, right? Now let's look at the formula for multiplier effect. And towards the end of the last class, I told you that it has two possible formulas. So we can calculate multiplier effect through two possible formulas. So one is very simple. So one would be change in GDP divided by change in injection, right? Now think about this. The way we write this down, have a look at this. Let me write this down on the whiteboard, right? So multiplier effect for a country can be calculated as change in GDP divided by change in injection, right? And we know that we write change through this mathematical sign, which is known as delta. So how much is the change in GDP due to change in, how much is the change in GDP due to change in injection? That is your multiplier effect. Is it making sense? Is it simple? Okay. Now looking at one example, let's say I was saying that for $5 million increase in investment, let's say if there is an overall 15 million increase in your GDP, right? How that happens, I'll tell you in a bit, right? Don't worry about it. I'll give you a real life example. So for $5 million increase in injection, if there's $15 million increase in GDP, that will give you an overall value of how much? 15 divided by 5 gives you how much? 3. So you will say that the multiplier effect or multiplier coefficient of this economy is 3. right? So you can call this multiplier effect, or the multiplier coefficient of this GD of this country is 3. Now what this means, that for every $1 increase in investment or injection, there will be overall $3 increase in GDP. For every $1 increase in investment, injection would be a better word, because injection, so think about this, sometimes I interchange the word injection with investment, but you need to remember that multiplier effect is not just about investment. It could also be about other injections, which includes the government spending and exports. So these are the 3 injections. So whichever injection we look at, the same would be the effect, whether that be investment, whether that be government spending, or whether that be exports. For every $1 increase, in injection, there is $3 increase in GDP, right? Now let's look at how it happens in real life. Why for $1 increase in investment or injection why is there more than $1 increase in GDP, right? So why is there $3 increase in GDP for $1 increase in injection? That's what we're about to look at. Okay, now think about this, Preet. Now, the way it happens, let's assume business, right? So let's say there is any business in Pakistan. Let's say there's Toyota manufacturing, Toyota cars manufacturing plant in Pakistan. Now, what they realize that, let's say the demand for their cars is increasing. So the demand for their cars is increasing. So what they do is that they increase their investment. They increased their investment. They set up another, what is that called? Factory. They set up another factory to produce more cars in Pakistan, because they saw that the demand for their cars is increasing. So obviously they would want to meet that demand to earn more profit, right? Now, when this happens, when there's more investment made by Honda in terms of establishing a new factory in Pakistan, what will that do? They will need to buy machines. They will need to set up that building, that factory where car manufacturing will take place, right? The building, right? Then they need to hire people for them to, work in that premises, worker salaries and stuff like that. When they hire all these resources, right, what happens? Everyone, or a lot of people in Pakistan will start earning more. They will start earning more, right? So let's say workers that are hired, they earn salaries, they earn wages, right? And with those salaries and wages, they will go spend on food, clothes, home rents and stuff like that. Similarly, the building that you make, that will become the income for construction workers, right? Construction firms, or whatever you want to call it, right? So construction firms will earn more due to this construction that is going on, right? And so on and so forth. So what happens basically, that it starts a trickle-down effect. Have you ever heard of trickle-down effect? So trickle-down effect is when one thing is changing in an economy and that affects a couple of other things. Trickle-down effect, right? So when one thing is happening in the economy, it affects a couple of other things in the country, right? Similarly, machines will make income for the companies producing machines, and so on, right? Okay, now this being said, what happens overall when all these people get more incomes? They spend more, they consume more, they then start demanding more goods and services. When that happens, there is overall a bigger increase in the GDP, which is the national income, which is the total income of the countries, which is the total income of all the people living in a country, and therefore your GDP increases by more than what was the initial investment. So if your initial investment, as I was mentioning, that Honda, let's say, established a new factory by spending $5 million on all these resources that I've listed below, right? By spending $5 million, some portion of $5 million on machines, some portion of $5 million on building, some portion of $5 million on hiring more workers. But overall, that generated income for all these different groups or all these different individuals in a country. And then they in turn started spending more on goods and services. That overall, the GDP of a country will increase by more than the $5 million initial investment that was made. Does this help, Preet? Is it making sense? Is there anything confusing? right? So let me write this down, right? Um, by amount of injection. Okay, Preet, does it make sense, right? So what did we say? Why multiplier effect actually takes place in real life? Because when there is a rise in injection, as I gave you a very comprehensive example, that one of the businesses in Pakistan is expanding their operations, because obviously we know when there's more demand for the products, you have to expand your business, you will set up more factories, you will set up more production, production plants and whatever, right? So in this rise in injection, it generates income for individuals. How? Because all the people that you are hiring, they will earn more incomes. Or if previously, if they were unemployed, now they start earning more, so they will demand more goods and services. Similarly, the building that you construct, the machines that you buy, for everything, every resource that you get is that would generate some income for other people. And then in result, these people who are earning more now will be going out in the market, and they will be spending, they will be making transactions, they will be demanding goods and services, and eventually the overall increase in country's GDP will be more than the initial amount of injection. That's how this entire things work. Very good, perfect. So that's one of the two formulas of multiplier effect that we have seen. But then there's another formula as well, which I'm writing this down, right? So another way to calculate the multiplier effect is 1 divided by, I'll explain you, 1 divided by marginal propensity to save, then marginal rate of tax, and marginal propensity to import. Now, what is this formula and how do we calculate multiplier effects with this? That's what I'm about to show you, right? So another way that you can calculate the multiplier effect for an economy is through this formula, right? So let me, okay, so it would be 1, right, divided by marginal propensity to save, MPS, which stands for marginal propensity to save, plus MRT, which is marginal rate of tax, plus MPM, which is marginal propensity to import. Now, what is each one of these things that I've written over here, right? Now, each one of these things is basically your leakages from the system. So each of these three terms is showing you one of the three possible leakages that can take place in an economy, right? Now, what is first marginal propensity to save? A quick recap for you, right? So that was how much will be the change in savings due to change in incomes, right? And if let's say this is 60%, this means that whenever there is $1 increase in anyone's income, that person saves 60 cents and spends only 40 cents. Right? So this is marginal propensity to save. If this is 60%, this means that 60% of your additional income is being saved and 40% of your additional income is being spent. Okay. Similarly, for marginal rate of taxation. So marginal rate of taxation has to do with taxes, right? So how much will be the change or rise in your taxes when your incomes increase, right? That is captured by marginal rate of taxation. So its formula would be change in taxation due to change in income. So if this is 20%, now what this means, every time you earn $1 additional, government takes away 20 cents from that. Whenever an individual earns $1 in additional income, government takes away 20 cents from that, right? So that is marginal rate of taxation. And the third thing here is marginal propensity to import. What is marginal propensity to import? So marginal propensity to import shows that how much will be the rise in imports when incomes in a country increase. So change in imports divided by change in income, right? Marginal propensity to import. So if let's say this is 30%, right? So what does 30% marginal propensity to import means? It means that out of $1 additional, or let's say 100 additional dollars that an individual earns, 30% of that would be spent on imports, and the remaining 70% would be spent perhaps elsewhere and so on, right? Is it making sense? Okay, now let's do an example so that we get a better idea of how we use this formula to calculate the multiplier effect, right? Now I'm assuming that the marginal propensity to save is 20%, so I will write 20% as 0.2. I'm assuming that the marginal rate of taxation is 0.1, which means 10% taxation, and I'm assuming that marginal propensity to import is 15%, which I will write as 0.15. Now all we have to do is to add up these figures and then find the final value, right? So that will give you 0.2 plus 0.1, 0.3, and 0.15 will give you 0.45. So your all leakages from the economy, which includes savings, tax, and imports, that's adding up to 0.45. So when 1 divided by 0.45 you do, what's the answer that you get? Let me use a calculator for this. So that will give you 2.222, right? So let's round this off to 0.223, right? Now this is your multiplier coefficient. Using the formula that I've written on the board, the multiplier effect, or the multiplier coefficient as we sometimes say, is 2.23. Now what that means, as I just explained to you, that for each $1 increase in injection, there will be $2.23 increase in the country's GDP. Does it make sense? For every $1 increase in country's GDP, there will be a $2.23 increase in GDP. Preet, is everything clear? Is there any confusion? Right? So using both the formulas, we have just seen how we calculate the multiplier effect of an economy, right? So that is what the multiplier effect actually shows and how we interpret it, right? So this was one formula, right? So 1 divided by all the leakages, and this was the other formula that we looked at before, right? So change in GDP or change in injection, that's one way of calculating it. Another way of calculating the multiplier effect is 1 divided by marginal propensity to save, marginal rate of taxation, and marginal propensity to import, right? So you can use any, depending upon the data that's provided in the MCQs, because often on the MCQs you'll see such questions being asked. So depending upon the data that's available, you will make use of one of the two formulas. Easy? Any confusion so far? Breathe. Anything that's not clear, anything you want to ask? Okay. Now this being said, right, and one thing before, I might add before we move on, now you have to look at the relationship. So if these leakages are decreasing, if the leakages in the economy are decreasing for X, Y, Z, D, whatever reasons, overall your multiplier effect will increase. How so? Let me show you, right? So if instead of 0.2, this thing would have been 0.1, right? This thing would have been 0.1, and this thing also let's say if that imports thing have been 0.1. So now this gives you 1 over 0.3. Now if this drops, the value in the denominator decreases, then 1 divided by 0.3 will give you 3.333, right? So your overall multiplier effect changes to 3.333. So you can see for yourself that lower the leakages from the system, higher will be your multiplier effect. Lower the leakages, lesser would be the right word, lesser the leakages, right? Because more money is staying in the system, and obviously that will overall generate more income overall. Lesser the leakages from the system, right? We know what the 3 leakages are. Greater will be the country's multiplier coefficient. Greater will be the country's multiplier effect. Any confusion? Preet, is there any confusion, anything that you did not get? Great. Okay, perfect. Now, one more thing before we move on to the next topic today, right? And that is accelerator. Now, what is accelerator? right? The accelerator is also a very important topic that we're about to look at, right? Accelerator effect, as we say, right? Just like we were using the word multiplier effect. Now, the second thing, which is related to Keynesian gross, and that what we are about to look at, is known as accelerator effect. Accelerator effect. Now think about this, please. You have to listen to this carefully. What happens when a country is booming? Now think about this. When a country like China, India, because these are some recent examples which have grown at very high rates, in countries like India and China, what happens when companies see why we have why these countries attract all the investment? Why is Google setting up in India, which I think it already exists? Why is Amazon operating in India and China, and all these big multinational companies, trillion-dollar companies are located in India and China? Is because they have huge income levels. These countries have huge income levels, huge GDP levels, which means that the consumer spending power is much more compared to spending power in countries like Pakistan, and Bangladesh is a relatively smaller country, and a lot of other countries, right? So what I'm trying to say over here is that accelerator effect, I'll write this down, let me write it down over there, so accelerator effect, right? Have a look at this. So accelerator effect captures change in investment that businesses, or rise would be a better word, because we know that there is always a direct relationship. Accelerator effect captures the rise in investment that businesses do following a rise in the GDP. Now let's talk about this, right? So Pete, what I'm saying over here is that, think about this, it goes both ways. So in the multiplier effect, now let me tell you, in the multiplier effect, you have to listen to this carefully. We saw that how the GDP would change, due to investment or due to injection, right? How the GDP would change due to change in injection or due to change in investment. So what we were thinking about in the multiplier effect was, in the multiplier effect, we were thinking about that injection is causing a change in GDP, but that can also go the other way around. So in the multiplier effect, we assumed, or not assumed, right? We were capturing that how rise in investment is causing a change in the country's GDP. How a rise in investment of a country is bringing a change in the country's GDP, right? So this was causing this. So this, right? So this thing was causing this thing, right? Now in the accelerator effect, we are looking at the opposite, right? So that's the easiest way to remember. In the accelerator effect, we are looking at the opposite. So we are looking at how the GDP of a country, how a rise in the country's GDP, national income, cause a rise in the country's investment, right? So why both of these two are true, I'll explain you, right? I've already explained you that how the multiplier effect happens and what's the reasoning behind it. But accelerator effect, let's talk about this now. So accelerator effect says that businesses would want to make more investment in countries which are already booming. Businesses would want to make an investment in countries which are already booming. Does it make sense? Right? So as I gave you the example that if, let's say, in Asia, China and India are the biggest economies, right? Which are in fact, I guess, the top, they're part of the top 3 economies in the world, then obviously multinational businesses would want to capture these big markets, knowing the fact that here consumers have more spending power, they buy more, they spend more. And obviously if these companies are located over there, then they will also get more, their overall revenue will increase, their overall profitability will increase. So definitely they don't want to miss out the chance of capturing these markets, right? So Preet, is this helping you? Right? So, right. Multiplier looks at how investment is causing the change in GDP, and accelerator is doing the opposite, how GDP causes a rise in investment, right? Now, to give you an explanation, and then we move forward from here, right? Accelerator effect captures So accelerator effect captures the rise in investment that businesses do following a rise in the country's GDP. Now, what's the reason for that? Businesses are more interested in investing with higher national GDP that shows higher purchasing power of therefore allow businesses. Is it simple, right? So the idea is fairly simple, right? So businesses are in the outlook of opportunities through which they can get highest revenues or highest profits. And what's the best way of going around it? The best way of going around this is to identify economies or countries that are growing and booming, and you locate in those countries, right? Is this simple? And how do we calculate the accelerator effect? Let me show you that. So accelerator effect is calculated as change in investment comes in the numerator. Now, do remember this. This is always very confusing and students mess this up in their MCQs. So in the case of accelerator, investment comes in the numerator. And what goes in the denominator? Change in GDP goes in the denominator. Because do remember, whichever of the two variables is independent, that is, right? So my accelerator effect is basically change in investment divided by change in GDP. So this is now investment is in the numerator, and this thing. What is this thing, right? National income is in the denominator, right? Whereas the multiplier effect, I'm writing both on the same slide so that you can easily compare. And the accelerator effect was equal to change in GDP. So GDP was in the numerator, change in GDP due to change in injection or change in injection, or for the sake of simplicity right now, I'm just writing change in investment. Is this clear, Preet? Is it making sense? Are we good on this? Okay, now if everything is clear, so this brings us towards completion of the idea of multiplier effect. So this brings us towards the completion of the idea of Keynesian cross, in which we have talked about Keynesian cross. Obviously, we have talked about the multiplier effect, and we have talked about the accelerator effect. Right now, we are about to start a new topic, which is also very important, and it's part of Unit 4, which is macroeconomics. Right. So you would remember I did tell you that we are doing Unit 4 of A2 economics, which is macroeconomics, and in this we'll talk about couple of different macroeconomic concepts. Now we are moving towards another very important topic from exam point of view, which is national income statistics, right? So national income statistic. What's national income statistic, right? Let me write this down first. So national income, we have already been using this term very frequently. National income for an individual means how much I earn, right? For an individual, my income simply means how much I earn, right? So if I'm doing one job, so the total amount that I earn from that job, the salary, commissions, bonuses, I add that up, that would be my income. Similarly, if I ask someone else his or her income, then that would comprise of how much they earn through their jobs, through their part-time work, through whatever sources of income they have, right? So things like that. Now, when I talk about national income, it's not just the income of me or my household, right? It's the income of everyone in that country. So when I say India's national income or Pakistan's national income, I mean all income of all Indians, if in case of India, and incomes of all Pakistanis, if I'm trying to calculate it for Pakistan, right? Now, think about it. National income, or in fact, I can write this down in the notes, right? Now, the next topic in this unit that we're about to discuss is national income statistics, right? Okay. Now, this being said, let's first define what national income is, right? So, national income would be all individuals So that's national. We do know what national means. So that is what national income is. Okay. Now, what do we mean when we say national income statistics? So national income statistics includes all possible, includes different approaches to calculating income in country. Okay, now have a look at this. National income statistics include different approaches, right? Now, what are these different approaches? What are the different ways to calculate the total income of people living in a country? That is what national income statistics are. So national income statistics include different approaches to calculating the total income of people living in a country, right? Now, what are the approaches that we need to discuss? So the first one that we have already been talking about a lot is gross national product. The GDP, sorry, not gross national product. So the first one that we are about to discuss is gross domestic product, which we have already been. So the first national income statistic that we discuss in today's class is gross domestic product. Then there is another one which is known as gross national product, right? Gross national product. Now, what's the difference between the two? We'll talk about this, right? And then there are two more. I'm not writing the other two at the moment, but we'll come back to this, right? Now, is everything clear? National income, total income of all people who are living in a country, as simple as that. So if I say what is India's national income, right? I mean all the people in India collectively, how much do they make 1 year in 1 year? Normally it's for 1 year. Similarly, if I say what's the national income of China, that would include all the incomes, that would include incomes of all the people who are living in China, right? Okay. Now, what are different approaches to calculate these? National income statistics is basically, it includes all different approaches to calculating the total income of people living in a country, right? So the first one being gross domestic product. Let's plot purpose. We can use the short form, which is GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the what people living in a country, regardless of their nationality status. Okay, think about this. Now, what do we mean when we say the GDP of Pakistan? We are looking at whatever income is being made by all the people who are living within Pakistan. Now, whether they are Pakistani nationals or whether they are Chinese or whether they're Americans or whether they are Britishers who are working in Pakistan and earning something, every person's income would be part of the GDP. Right, we can do that, right? So let me quickly complete off the two definitions, or in other words, it of a country, right? So whatever is being produced within the borders of a country, that is GDP, right? Now, whether, let's say, if an American is working in Pakistan, his income would also, let's say, American is working American embassy, so his income would also be part of Pakistan GDP because that is produced within the borders of Pakistan, right? So we are not concerned about the nationality, who is generating that income, but that's only looking at if that income is being produced in Pakistan, which means that within the borders of Pakistan or not. Now, gross national product, which we, the short form for which is GNP. Now, what is GNP, right? Now, GNP, on the other hand, takes a different approach. Now, you have to listen to this carefully, and then we'll stop here for today. So, GNP, gross national product, is the certain regardless of their place of residence. Now think about this. A lot of Indians, a lot of Pakistanis are working in foreign countries, right? Now, when we say GDP, so any Indian that is living outside India would not, like his or her income would not be part of India's GDP. Why? Because that person is not generating income within the borders of India. Does this help? right? But when I say GNP, gross national product of India, then in that case, yes, I will include the income of Indians who are living outside India. Why? Because they are again they belong to that country, they belong to that nationality, right? So GNP is the income of only a certain country's nationals, regardless of their place of residence. For instance, if outside India, then is of India's GNP, but not part of India's GDP. Did you get this? Right? So any country's national who is living outside that country, his or her income would be part of that country's GNP, gross national product, but that person's income would not be part of that country's GDP because that person is not living in that country, not within the borders, right? So these are the two things that you have to be very careful with. GDP, income of everyone, whether Indian, not Indian, American, Chinese, British, or whoever is working in India, his or her income is part of India's GDP. Whereas for gross national product, it's only the income of those country nationals and regardless of wherever they are living. Now we'll stop here for today, and next class I'll also show you the formula for this GNP. How do we calculate GNP from GDP, right? So I'll just write this down and then stop here. How GNP. So this will be the starting point of our next class, right? So let's stop it for today, and then I'll see you tomorrow at the same time, right? You good? Okay, take care. Have a good day. Bye.